This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Welcome to Asian Insider, a podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. Now, over the last 10 years or so, Southeast Asia has become a major center for transnational criminal networks targeting millions around the world with scamming operations. These organizations emanate mostly from China, are physically centered mainly in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, but elsewhere too. The Philippines is another center. The scams range from money laundering and crypto fraud to so-called love scams, in English referred to as pig butchering scams, a translation of the Chinese sha ju pan. It is a crude name, but a sophisticated industry. These scam centers lure thousands of young and tech-savvy victims from around the region, places with high unemployment like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, even further from Africa, to work essentially as forced labor, calling numbers globally to target people with these scams. As of the end of 2023, according to a report released in May by the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP, scam centers operating out of Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos account for $39 billion in stolen funds. I would urge all of you, in fact, listening out there to check out USIP's report. It's on the Institute's website. Now, I could go on about this, and I have a special interest. I am a member of the board of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, GI-TOC. I should say, though, today I do not speak for GI-TOC. I have instead a guest who is an expert on these scam centers, Jason Tower, Country Director for the Burma Program at the United States Institute for Peace. Jason, welcome to Asian Insider. Thanks for making the time to talk about this very critical subject that affects millions, people like you and me and our listeners today. I think all of us at some time or the other have been targeted. So ubiquitous are these scams.
Thanks, Nirmal, for having me on.
So, Jason, when we last spoke, you mentioned forced labor cyber scamming as a growing national security threat, that it drives violence and conflict. Could you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Basically, what we're seeing now is that these industrial scale scam compounds that you just referred to in particularly the countries of Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, but also spreading into other jurisdictions as well. They've now targeted people in over 100 countries around the world. So you have victims of these pig butchering scams from over 100 countries, with the average victim losing more or less all of their assets. We're talking about losses, one victim, $100,000 to $300,000 US dollars. Some cases, as much as $50 million US dollars have been lost in one case. So this is a massive wealth transfer to malign actors in Southeast Asia, actors who are undermining governance, corrupt actors, individuals who also have close ties to militia groups. So this is the first component of why this is a global security threat. I mean, you've got people around the world who are targeted, and countries are not able to keep their nationals safe from these scams. Secondly, though, these are forced labor compounds. You've got hundreds of thousands of people, according to the UN, according to USIP's own research, hundreds of thousands of people who have been tricked or deceived or trafficked into these large scam compounds. Now, in order to imprison people inside of the compounds, generally the compounds need to securitize. Many of them are located along borders, often in places where you have very weak states or you have really no strong or fragmented state sovereignty over some of these regions. Particularly around Thailand, all of Thailand's borders, you now see heavily securitized compounds that are very well guarded by, for example, the Myanmar military's Border Guard Force, which is one of the main players involved in providing security and protection to these compounds. But then in other places like Laos and the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone, you also have very large private security forces that are very well armed. So if Thailand wants to deal with this issue, if it wants to rescue people out of compounds, it needs to look at the security threat on its border, the fact that these different armed actors have actually securitized the border. They're very well armed. It's not easy to access or enter into these compounds. It's very difficult to get victims out. So this is another threat. You've got threats to border security. You've got the increasing securitization of these compounds. Then turning a moment to U.S. national security, of course, there's the threat of Americans being trafficked or trapped into these scam compounds. And that has happened. Americans, along with the nationals of more than 66 countries around the world, have been trafficked and subjected to torture inside of the compounds. But another element of this also is the response that's currently underway by some countries. So, for example, presently you have the Chinese police who are becoming more and more proactive in responding to the situation. Interestingly, a few years ago, you had many of these illicit Chinese casino networks who actually poured a lot of the illicit capital into projects that were later given a Belt and Road Initiative label. Of course, many of those projects with the contracts going to Chinese state-owned enterprises later ended up turning into the scam compounds themselves, right? Now, interestingly, that this has become a global problem, you see where the Chinese police are increasingly looking to get access to these compounds. And China is linking this to its new global initiative, the Global Security Initiative, as a means of promoting its involvement in changing global security norms. So you see where this is increasingly politicized by China. China is involved in crackdowns, but it's looking for countries also to align with its global security initiative, not necessarily something that most countries around the world are going to want to do. Now, there's a worry here that, one, you'll have Chinese police increasingly involved in spreading authoritarian police norms around the world. But then, two, that China is not going to be willing to cooperate when you have criminals from the PRC increasingly scamming Americans. So this is yet another element of the threat that the U.S. faces from a national security standpoint.
Right. So you mentioned the growth, the cyber scam compounds on the Myanmar-Thai border, across Myanmar, in the Laos, the Golden Triangle, Special Economic Zone, Cambodia. And of course, there are others further afield in South Asia and Africa. Yet we also have examples, quite recently, in fact, of authorities trying to crack down. The Chinese, as you say, the Lao authorities quite recently. But clearly, there's still not enough suppression and enforcement because the industry continues to thrive. We read about enforcement, but is it just tokenism?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind here is that the criminal networks that are behind the scam compounds, they're extremely well networked around the globe. So you now have at least 4 key hotspots in Southeast Asia, but the organized crime groups have also sought to build out new hubs in Africa, in the Middle East. You've seen where Dubai has started to emerge. Recently, there's been a lot of reports about Sri Lanka. There's been reports about Uganda. Part of what we need to consider in terms of these crackdowns is that the vast majority of crackdowns focus on one geographical area at a time. So at the moment, you have a pretty significant crackdown underway in the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone. But you don't really have the same forms of crackdowns underway in Cambodia. No one's really doing much of anything at this point to put pressure on the Moy River area that separates Myanmar and Thailand. So a lot of the criminal actors that had been involved in online scamming in the Golden Triangle Zone have now just simply pivoted. They've moved their operations to Cambodia. They've moved their operations especially to Myanmar's border with Thailand around the Moy River area in the Myawaddy region. But then many of them are also pivoting to new jurisdictions around the world. And this is really part of the problem. You have these bilateral or sometimes minilateral crackdowns that focus on one or two areas, but the criminals generally are able to get advance information that the crackdown is coming. The kingpins have long moved out by the time law enforcement actually starts to enter into the compounds. And really, mostly the people that are cleared out are trafficking victims, or they're very low-level players in these criminal syndicates. You're not seeing in the vast majority of these crackdowns where they're actually able to get kingpins or the heads of some of the scam syndicates. I think if you look closely at what's gone on with the crackdown in the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone, it was actually Zhao Wei himself, the chair of the zone, the Chinese organized crime figure, who led the whole operation. And it was very much choreographed. He organized a large meeting of many of the businesses inside, told them that this crackdown was coming in advance of law enforcement starting a patrol of the Golden Triangle Special Economic Zone. A circular was distributed to all of the different so-called businesses inside of the zone, a good week in advance. So anyone who had any connections at all knew that this was coming. And I think that this is another element of the challenges we face around these one-off crackdowns, is that really states are often reliant on the criminal actors that have come to control these different, almost you would call them special crime zones, but these zones where the criminal activity happens. They're relying on local actors that have either been fully co-opted or who are the criminals themselves that are now controlling many of these territories.
Yeah, interesting situation. Now, ASEAN has been talking about this for some time now, a couple of years at least. 1 year ago, I think senior officials from ASEAN, China, and the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they had agreed to address transnational organized crime, trafficking in persons associated with these casinos and scam centers. Has that amounted to anything? What can they do? I assume they have to rely on local law enforcement. And in some of these places, as you've sort of sketched out, local law enforcement is virtually absent or is beholden to these syndicates.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the key challenges with ASEAN's response is that you have a number of states in the region really where their economies have almost been transformed into scam economies. So, I mean, if you look at some of the numbers for Myanmar, for Cambodia, or for really the Mekong region more broadly, you're seeing where the scam GDP, the amount that's brought in by these online scams, has come to rival countries' formal GDPs. So in Cambodia, if you look at the numbers, the scam economy represents roughly 40% of the country's official GDP. So this means it's going to be very difficult to get consensus within ASEAN for a strong crackdown on these issues. You're going to have many countries that are going to be very resistant to moves to crack down. And I think that that's been one of the key challenges within the ASEAN region, is that you have quite a few countries in the region, because their economies have become so dependent on this, because you have such a high level of state capture as a result of the growing power and influence of these transnational criminal networks, that a lot of these moves to crack down have really not been very effective. Now, I should say, though, that many countries in the region are also getting increasingly concerned about this because it is a national security threat. I mean, if you take a country like Singapore, for example, the number one form of crime in Singapore is now online scamming, right? So I think police are really shifting, national priorities are shifting to put more and more resources into trying to combat this, because it really is the key evil within society that most people are facing. I think it's quite similar in Malaysia, where you're seeing now that each individual citizen of the country, there's an attempted scam perpetrated 1.6 times per year. And then losses are really also adding up quite significantly in many of the countries, particularly more developed or middle income countries in the region. And I think that that's shifting to cause countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines to try to push more within both the ASEAN platform as well as bilaterally to try to address some of these challenges. Of course, a lot can be done just simply by awareness raising, simply by changing legal frameworks, cracking down, for example, as the Philippines has done on the online gambling businesses that were a front for a lot of the scam syndicates that were operating in that particular country. And you've seen where I think that there has been some positive progress that has been made in countries like the Philippines over the past couple of months, as some of those regulatory loopholes have been closed. Maybe then turning to the UNODC China ASEAN initiative, I think this is something that is positive on one level. I mean, at least it's raising awareness of the problem. It's trying to push states in a direction of working together on trying to combat this. I guess, though, the challenge here remains the same. You've seen where many countries that are hosting these scam hubs, like Cambodia, even when it comes to dealing with China on these issues, there's been very strong pushback. You don't really have pushback from Cambodia vis-a-vis China on really any other issue except for this one, except for when China pushes Cambodia around online scamming. And you may recall the movie No More Bets. Perhaps we talked about that last time a little bit, but the movie No More Bets, which is a Chinese movie that highlights the threats coming from online scams in Southeast Asia. This movie was banned in Cambodia, and you even saw where both Cambodia and several other countries in the region lodged protest with China over some of the content of that movie. Now, I think there is an opportunity here in 2025, particularly with Malaysia taking on role as ASEAN chair. This is the 10th anniversary of the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on Combating Transnational Crime. And perhaps this is an opportunity really for Malaysia to exert a little bit of leadership on this issue. I mean, you are seeing where in places like Myanmar, you've got now these criminal groups who are controlling large territories. And that's not something I think that most states in the region are going to have much of an appetite for over the longer term.
How effective are U.S. Treasury sanctions? The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned a Cambodian business tycoon recently over links to human trafficking and forced labor in cyber and virtual currency scams. Chow Wei, whom you mentioned earlier, is also subject to U.S. Treasury sanctions. How effective are they? It does depend eventually on implementation, right?
Well, I think one interesting thing to see, you saw now that the US has introduced some new sanctions, particularly on Ly Yong Phat in Cambodia, who's one of the notorious business figures who's been involved there in online scam compounds. He operates a particularly notorious compound, the Osmek Hotel and Casino there, that you have countless cases of documented human trafficking and scamming occurring out of that compound. This is one of the first designations, I think, that you've seen where explicitly sanctions are targeting those involved in hosting industrial scale scam facilities. I think if you look at some of the broader efforts of the US and of other countries to place sanctions on criminal actors, this is a relatively new approach. Mm-hmm. And I think it does have some impact in terms of the first thing it does is it gets a lot of banks to think twice about whether or not they want to have dealings with particularly those individuals, but then also with perhaps the banking systems that those individuals are using in those various countries. So I think that there's been some impact on the sanctions on Jiawei in Laos, for example. Then when you look at the sanctions that have just been announced in Cambodia, I think one thing that they can also do is send a signal. You've now had the UK put out some sanctions on criminal actors in the region that are involved in this, some of these high-level players. You've seen where China has issued arrest warrants for the leaders of the Myanmar military's border guard force that were involved in this scamming on the China border that happened last year, with some of those criminal actors being actually extradited to China by the Myanmar military regime back in January. And then now you have these new U.S. designations, which I think do add another layer of pressure and a pretty strong signal, I think, to others that may be hosting or providing protection to this criminal activity, that if they don't do something quickly, they may really reach a tipping point. And in many countries in the region, if you look at the size of the scam economy, there's a risk that they're evolving into scam states.
Okay, that's really interesting, grim, but interesting and hopeful actually as well. To talk about the wider context just for a moment, there is now apparently a draft of a UN Cybercrime Convention, and there is some hope that it will be ratified by signatories in a few months, but it could take as long as another year. Until that happens, transnational cybercrime is covered by the 2001 Budapest Convention, which, however, has a limited number of signatories. So one can hope, but I'm not sure to what degree the UN Convention will be a game changer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think certainly looking at the Budapest Convention, really the majority of states in Southeast Asia that are involved in industrial scale scamming are not members of that.
Right.
I think the only one that is a member which has been hit by some of this activity is the Philippines. If you look at the big players, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, neighboring Thailand, they're not members. I think, of course, there's a lot of concerns about the new treaty when it comes to human rights, when it comes to data privacy, and some of these issues. I think another challenge here is that we don't really have a year to wait, right? So even if you do have a more inclusive treaty that has a lot more countries involved, I think it's going to take then a very long time for individual countries to start making changes to their own laws, their own domestic laws, to align them with the new treaty. And then it's also going to take even more time, I think, to get cooperation in place to start using those new tools. And in the meantime, I think this is really a global crisis that demands action now. We have hundreds of thousands of victims across the United States. There's similarly across the Southeast Asia region, hundreds of thousands of victims of these scams. And the numbers are increasing on a daily basis. So I think that this is really something that warrants much more dramatic attention. It's probably also something that needs to be disaggregated from a broader set of issues around cybercrime. This is a specific form of cybercrime, these pig butchering scams that involve really, they're very sophisticated and complex in terms of just the number of different criminal markets that they're touching on. You have the elements of human trafficking, you have the elements of torture, you have the elements of securitization of these compounds, you have the issues and challenges with corruption and state co-optation. And then you have the very sophisticated technologies that the criminal actors are using to actually roll out the scams, but then also the cryptocurrency component of things. Mm-hmm. And so I think what may need to happen in the interim is, one, states are going to have to start looking much, much more closely at how social media is being used by these criminal actors. I think there's pretty low-lying fruit in terms of if there were new regulations put in place that checked the ability of criminal actors to exploit social media, that would make it very difficult for them to find targets online. If criminal actors no longer had the ability to add 5,000 new people on a WhatsApp account each day or a Telegram account each day, and then begin these efforts to start building romantic relationships with those individuals. If there were a way to shut that off, I think that would make some progress in disrupting this. I think equally, if there were a move to do more to regulate cryptocurrency, because the vast majority of these scams are in crypto, right? If there were a move to address some of these cryptocurrency platforms that have extremely weak or know your customer type of protocols, that's also another way I think you could see a disruption of some of this activity. But then also importantly, really a very strong push to disrupt large-scale scam compounds and scam cities. We need to have a higher bar, right? I think that at this point, most of the conversations are around how do we identify victims or how do we get victims out of these large compounds?
Right.
The conversation really needs to focus on how do we fundamentally shut down all of these large-scale scam compounds, some of which are holding 10,000 or more people in forced criminality. There needs to be a red line drawn somewhere. And I think really that's where there needs to be a lot more creative thinking about how to gain access to areas that are hosting this scam activity, particularly in borderlands, for example, where I think Thailand is in particular one of the key countries that's suffering as a result of a large amount of these types of scam compounds on its borders.
Right. Fascinating topic. Thanks, Jason. A topic which should resonate with everyone, with all of us. The public at large needs way more information and education on this. Jason Tao, thank you very much for joining me on Asian Insider today. Good to have you on board.
Thanks so much for having me on, Nirmal.
That nicely wraps this discussion up for the Asian Insider podcast. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. Join me and my expert guests on the 3rd and 4th Friday of every month.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.